I'm Bradley Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And on behalf of the entire staff at PNP and the entire staff here at Sixth and I Synagogue, I'd like to welcome you. We at Politics and Prose really love doing author talks here at Sixth and I. I mean, how could you not enjoy being in this marvelous setting? And as much as we would have liked to have all of you at the store up at Connecticut and Nebraska, obviously you would not have all fit. In the span of just a decade, Sixth and I has become truly a vibrant center of cultural life here in the Washington area, and we at the bookstore would just like to congratulate the staff here for making this place as great as it's become. We of course have a very interesting guest here this evening, one with a very compelling message. Those of you who read the New York Times will easily recognize the name Nicholas Kristof. His byline has been appearing in the paper for 30 years. After stints as a correspondent in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo, and then time as an associate managing editor responsible for the Sunday editions, Nick started his regular columns in the Times in 2001. Those columns have become known especially for their frequent focus on global health, on poverty, on gender issues in the developing world. Time and again, he has highlighted human rights abuses and social injustices. His writing on Darfur won a Pulitzer Prize 8 years ago. That was his second Pulitzer. His first in 1990 went to him and his wife, Cheryl Woodan, for their coverage of China. Cheryl herself spent nearly 20 years at the New York Times, both as a correspondent and then as an executive on the news and business sides of the paper before leaving about 7 years ago for the banking world. She and Nick have written several books together. A Path Appears is their fourth, and it's addressed to many of us who have a desire to give back to the world, who want to help improve health, boost education, prevent violence, and generally make life better for others. But we may not be quite sure how best to go about doing all that. At times, the problems may appear quite overwhelming and irreparable. And anyway, we're all so busy, and the vast majority of us don't have much time or large sums of money to contribute. How can we make a difference? How can we choose among all the worthy causes, among the countless appeals from nonprofit groups, among local and global initiatives? Is it even worth trying? Nick and Cheryl tackle these questions, as you might expect very skilled, experienced journalists to do. That is through engaging stories enhanced with lots of research. Their message is inspirational and it's hopeful. And the book comes filled with quite a bit of practical advice, including a final section titled 6 Steps You Can Take in the Next 6 Minutes, and a list of useful organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Nicholas Kristof.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's great to be here. This is really a kind of a solemn location. I feel like I need to be particularly serious and, kind of pious here, but that impulse won't last too long, so don't worry. I should also say that I hadn't realized that, Bradley Graham is a byline that I, admired for many, many years when I was at the Times when he was writing for the Washington Post, and I didn't realize until just now that he had found new life as a bookstore owner. And that may indeed be a better business model than journalism. So compliments there. Cheryl sends her regrets. We have 3 kids, 2 are in college, but our baby is a high school senior now. And if we were to travel together on the road, then our daughter would have the wildest parties you can imagine. So I'm here by my lonesome today, and our daughter is probably gnashing her teeth as a result. And also, I mean, as we were backstage, Brad was mentioning that it's an unusually youthful audience, and indeed, one of the things I really admire about kind of the millennial generation is how engaged they are in so many social issues, and often the degree to which you guys are engaged in sometimes wiser ways than my generation was. So it's kind of incumbent on anybody who's middle-aged to complain about how awful young people are, but the truth is that I have a lot of admiration for your generation and kind of for the aspiration you have to leave an imprint on the world. We're also, I'm kind of flattered because we're just beginning our book tour, so we're kind of your practice. But I think there are a few people here who are very much on the front lines. I think there's a crew from Youth Villages here somewhere. Okay, Youth Villages is an amazing organization we write about in the book, dealing with adolescents who have been in difficulties, and one of the remarkable things about it is that it is carefully built as evidence-based through randomized trials showing that it works, and indeed that it saves the state money because some of the alternatives like youth incarceration for young people are so expensive, and it has this amazing proven record of turning lives around. So thank you for your work. And also, for those of you, I'm not sure, have any of you had a chance to plow through the book a little bit? Well, one person you will meet in the book is Khadija Williams, and she is here. Khadija, can you just stand up for a moment? Khadija just has this most incredibly inspirational story. Grew up in California, was homeless for year after year after year. In high school, was getting up at 4 a.m., was living in a homeless shelter, getting up at 4 a.m. to then take a bus to school, returning after all her after-school activities at 11 p.m., and yet racking up an incredible academic and extracurricular record, and then got help from a great organization called South Central Scholars that tries to provide support from incredibly bright, talented kids who aren't necessarily getting the support they would get at home. And a doctor and his wife helped Khadija apply to Harvard, and there was an admissions interview, and the admissions interviewer basically told Harvard, "You've just got to take this kid." And they did. And you graduated 3 years ago, is that right? Last year, okay. It's been kind of a privilege for Cheryl and me to write about amazing people like Khadija, and not just write, but some of you probably watched the PBS documentary of her last book, Half the Sky. Did you see the PBS documentary, some of you? So, wasn't it good? There's now going to be a PBS documentary of A Path Appears. It's going to be out beginning in January, 4 hours, very similar, and also, I think, really powerful. So stay tuned. Let me explain a little bit both where the title comes from and how we happen to write about it. The title comes from a Chinese saying that by the writer Lu Xun, that hope is like a path in the countryside. At first there is nothing, and then because people walk this way again and again, a path appears. And to us it reflected kind of the emerging evidence base of what shows actually does work to make a difference, and also the degree to which that path is often partly about hope, and the need to convey hope to people who sometimes are in circumstances where they lack it. There were really a couple of reasons why we ended up writing A Path Appears. One was that after we wrote Half the Sky, people kept asking us, so what do I do to make a difference? And there really seemed to us to be a longing on the part of a lot of Americans to do, a lot of people all over the world, to do something, to have some kind of impact, some kind of legacy, and yet at the same time they felt kind of overwhelmed about the scale of the world's problems and wondered whether one person really can do anything, and also worried about corruption and inefficiency and all the difficulties that one reads about. And we really wanted to come back with a message that, yes, indeed, helping people is harder than it looks. It's difficult, but there are ways in which one really can have an impact, both abroad and at home, to expand opportunity. And so get engaged in that. And we just, we see this in all kinds of little ways. One of the things we write about in the book is kind of blindness called trachoma. It used to be common in the US. It's caused by infection. It's an incredibly painful way to go blind. We quote one woman in Mali who said that it was like the pain of childbirth, day in, day out, year in, year out. And because she lost her sight and was unable to work in the fields or look after her children, several of her children died. So it's not just the cost to one person. And then we saw a $40 surgery through a group called Helen Keller International, just $40 by a nurse, not even a doctor, that restored her eyesight. And Yagore, this woman, she comes up and gets the bandages removed, and somebody offers to help her, and she says, "Get out of my way, I can see now." And it's just, it truly is kind of biblical. I mean, it was just incredible what in the right circumstances one can achieve for modest sums. And it also, and I've been thinking about this now because we're obviously engaged in overseas military action, and, I'm a believer that the military toolbox sometimes is an important one, is a useful one. But I think we often hugely overinvest in the military toolbox and underinvest in the education toolbox and in the female empowerment toolbox. And I look at I look at countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, used to be part of the same country. Well, one thing that Bangladesh did after they separated in 1971 was that it emphasized education and educated girls in particular. And today in Bangladesh, there are more girls in high school than boys. And it hasn't solved Bangladesh's problems. There's still governance is a mess. It's got a lot of problems. But it doesn't have the kind of extremism that Pakistan, and especially the tribal areas of Pakistan, where female literacy is only 3%, has. Likewise, Yemen, we've been busy, using drones and other elements of the military toolbox in Yemen. Right next door to it is the country of Oman, which in the 1960s was even more backward, and then really began to invest in education. Today, Oman, again, it has plenty of problems, but it isn't home to the kind of extremism that we see. And so, there are times when one needs those military tools, but meanwhile, I see 3 million Syrian refugees outside the country who aren't getting an adequate education, especially girls in those camps. And we should be working on those, providing that kind of education, female empowerment efforts, at the same time to try to prevent problems from cropping up, down the road 10 years. So we wanted to kind of talk about some of the ways that change can be achieved, and encourage people to introduce them to some great organizations, and also just encourage people to kind of take risks on, just as South Central scholars took a risk on Khadija that paid off enormously and is going to pay off through her life. And I think so many of us have seen that in one way or another. One of our favorite stories in the book is about a story like that. It's about a African-American boy named Ali Neal who grew up in rural Arkansas. And he was very smart, but also kind of a troublemaker. And this was the late 1950s when he was growing up, so it was a segregated school, and the teachers were all black. He was always mouthing off to them, getting in trouble. Then he shoplifted from the store where he worked and got fired from his job. And he kind of seemed to be heading for trouble. And then one day he's in the school library set up by this wonderful teacher, school librarian named Mrs. Grady, and Ollie had reduced her to tears. He'd really kind of bullied her and made her cry. And he's skipping class, he's in the school library, and he's looking at the books, and he sees this book, this novel by an African-American author named Frank Yerby that has a cover with a woman in kind of a sort of scanty dress, at least by 1957 standards. And so it's the risque cover kind of attracts his eye, and he picks it up and looks at it, and he's kind of tempted to read it, but he's a tough kid, so it'd be embarrassing to check out a book from the school library, so he steals it. So he just puts it under his jacket and walks out. And he really likes it, and it really turns him on to reading, and he thinks, wow. So about a week later, he decides to return it, and he sneaks it back into the library, puts it back on the shelf, and sees another novel there, also by Frank Yerby. So he steals that. And so again, it's such a terrific read. He returns it and notices a book by Frank Yerby that he hadn't seen the previous 2 times. So he steals that one, and this happens a total of 4 times. And this really turns him on to reading, and he begins reading other novels, begins reading about current events, becomes much more studious, ends up going to college, then ends up going to law school, becomes one of Arkansas's first African-American lawyers, becomes a leader in the civil rights movement, and really devotes so much of his career to giving back, to helping the disadvantaged. Later becomes the first African-American prosecutor and judge in the area. And so he's sort of a hero in the alumni of this school. And so at one of the reunions, he goes back and he's feted, and he says to Mrs. Grady, I have a confession to make. This all evolved out of your library, but frankly, I stole your books. And then Mrs. Grady said, well, I have a confession right back. I saw you steal that first book. She had seen him steal it, and at first she was angry and wanted to confront him. What are you doing stealing a book when you can just check it out? And then in this flash of insight, she understood, he's a tough kid. He's afraid of seeming too much like a good student. So she lets him steal it. And then that weekend, she drives 70 miles to Memphis to go to the used bookstores and look for another book by Frank Yerby in hopes that maybe Ollie will like the first one so much that he's going to want another one. And at her 3rd bookstore, she finds one, she puts it back on the shelf, and she is just thrilled when Ollie steals that one too. And then she goes back to Memphis, and this is repeated 4 times. And, it had this transformative effect on him, and through him rippled through so many other lives. And this was from a woman who had every reason to feel embittered by the way life had treated her, and by the way Ollie had treated her. And yet she took a risk on him that paid off so well. And so, it always seems to me that there's something of a deficit of empathy in this country, and that there are so many ways, if we're willing to suspend that breach and take a risk on people. It doesn't always pay off. Sometimes people will take advantage, but there are ways to really help affect so many other lives. And indeed, that's kind of what we hope A Path Appears will lead to a little bit. On Friday, I was walking down 42nd Street in New York, and a man stopped me, and he said, are you Nick Kristof? And I said, yeah, a little nervously, so, maybe he was, very much against gun control or something. But no, he said he identified himself as the audio engineer who had recorded the audiobook of A Path Appears. And so we'd been listening for it for several days, and then kind of got to thinking, well, what can I do? And he thought, well, I know about recording things. That's my skill. And so he's decided to start a project where he's going to record children's stories and distribute them through nursery schools or Head Start or programs aimed at low-income parents who maybe don't have any children's books at home, or families where English isn't spoken at home, so that those kids can hear some children's stories before they start school. And that's I think there's so many people who want to find some way of giving back, and we hope that A Path Appears can encourage that. So that was one reason why Cheryl and I wrote the book. And the other reason, I guess, has to do a little bit with inequality. Inequality is one of these issues that has been very much in the news, and we all know that there really is a profound failure there when the top 1% in America own more than the bottom 90%, when the 85 richest people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 3 billion, and when the black-white wealth gap in this country is greater than the black-white wealth gap was in apartheid South Africa. But usually we look at inequality in metrics of income or wealth. And I've got to say from my reporting that it always seems to me the even greater gap of inequality is an opportunity. And there are so many kids in so many communities that, based on their zip code, they're more likely to end up in prison than in college. And that just should not be the case. In Britain, home of Downton Abbey, a place we think of as this class society, a child born in the bottom 20% of the distribution is 50% more likely to reach the top 20% than in this country. When economic mobility is greater in class-conscious Europe than it is here, then we have a profound problem. And it does seem to us, as we look at this, that the ways to address this are in part through earlier interventions. And one way that this came to us really was when we were writing Half the Sky. So Cheryl and I were gallivanting around the world trying to figure out how to address maternal mortality in Malawi or Tanzania or Cambodia. And meanwhile, I think some of you know I'm from Oregon, a kind of rural blue-collar area in Oregon. And my mom's still living on that place, and we go back every summer. And our next-door neighbors there are a family that has had trouble with meth, and our daughter's best friend there is a girl called Jessica. Her mom was in prison for attempted murder for a meth deal gone wrong. Jessica did not get any support. There were no kids' books in that home. And, we watched this girl who we'd seen grow up from very early on just get in more and more trouble. She was kicked out of school in the 6th grade for bringing alcohol to school. She began setting fires. She was getting in fights, and it became clear that she was, headed for pregnancy or prison, and we didn't know which. And this was happening literally in her own backyard. And it was so frustrating because it seemed emblematic of these opportunity gaps right here at home. And so we really tried to wade in to see, where is the leverage we can find to try to make a difference in lives of people like Jessica. And it seemed to us that overwhelmingly one of the lessons of the last half century is that one of the reasons that efforts to create opportunity haven't been more successful is in part because they come too late. That so much of us, of our brains, is formed in the first, say, 1,000 days of life from conception on. And if you miss that window, there's still some resilience, but it's limited. There was a fascinating natural experiment in Romania where there were many kids in these horrific orphanages where kids were never picked up, never cuddled, never spoken to. And then they were placed, when the regime collapsed in 1989, they were placed in good foster homes. Some of them were. And it turned out that what made the difference was not so much whether they were taken out and put in a good placement, in a good family, but rather how old they were when that happened. And if it happened before the child was 2, then kids were indeed somewhat resilient. They could recover some ground. If it happened after the age of 2, then they couldn't really recover much of that ground. And you can see in their brain scans, even when they were teenagers, you can clearly identify which ones of those weren't getting any stimulation in the first couple of years of life. And some of the evidence from this comes from animal experiments, the importance of social contact. It turns out that animals, humans alike, when we're under stress, we produce stress hormone called cortisol. And that's a good thing in brief amounts. But when you're constantly under stress, your brain is bathed with it as it's developing, and that affects the development of brain structures. It affects the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control. It affects the hippocampus. And so you can look at these either rats or humans that didn't get enough human contact and support early in life, and you can identify to some degree. We quote a neuroscientist in the book as saying that poverty is bad for a child's brain. And there's a biologist named Michael Meany who looked at rats and noticed that some rat mothers are kind of lickers and groomers, that they naturally are really attentive moms who are always licking their baby rats and cuddling them, and others are more kind of laissez-faire. And he wondered about the long-term impact of this. So he identified which baby rats were from each kind of mom, and then when they were adults, then he ran them through mazes and other things, and it turned out that the best predictor of whether a rat was good at mazes and was self-confident was whether it had been licked and groomed as a little baby rat. Well, he thought, well, maybe that's hereditary, and and so then he took the baby rats, the pups of the attentive moms, and at birth, and gave them to be raised by the laissez-faire moms, and vice versa. And it turned out that what mattered was not your biological parentage, but whether you were actually licked and groomed as a baby rat. And likewise, there's more research that suggests something along that line in humans, that at age 3.5, the degree of maternal attachment in a baby is a better predictor of high school graduation rates than IQ is. Likewise, I'm sure some of you have heard about the 30 million word gap, that a child to professionals has, by the age of 4, heard 30 million more words than a child on welfare. 30 million more. And they both begin speaking at the same time, but by age 4, that child to professionals has heard so much more that they're much more articulate, that the verbal centers of the brain are more developed, they're much better prepared for school. And this has to do with this kind of awkward issue that is hard to talk about a kind of inequality that it has to do with parenting gaps. And one lesson that some people draw from that is that it's kind of hopeless, and that one can't really do anything about it. And in fact, I think there's pretty good evidence that the opposite is true, that moms and dads want the best for their child, but they may have grown up in a household where people weren't reading stories to them, weren't talking to them. They may be under tremendous stress themselves. Especially if you're a single parent, that is an incredibly difficult and stressful job. And there are a growing number of interventions that kind of help and coach parents with these challenges. And they've been incredibly successful. One that we write about is called Nurse-Family Partnership, started by this guy, David Olds. Let's give Nurse-Family Partnership a hand. Okay. Do you work for Nurse-Family Partnership? Oh, okay. David Olds originally he was thought that he would make a difference by working with 4-year-olds. And he realized that even with 4-year-olds, some of these kids were so traumatized and lagged behind so that it was almost too late. And so then he started this program, Nurse Family Partnership, working initially with women when they're pregnant and continuing until the age of 2. And it's one of the examples we give in the book is of this mom who's pregnant. I think she was a teenager who, her name was Bonnie, and she was tough. She smoked, she was drinking, she's getting into fistfights, and the nurse who was visiting her, Stacy, suggested that maybe when she's pregnant she should lay off the smoking for a little while, and Bonnie threatened to slap her for saying that. But Stacy pressed and kept suggesting things, and finally Bonnie just confessed. She just broke down and said that when she was a baby she had been abused, and that she was just deathly afraid that under the pressure, especially if her baby cried, that she would do something terrible to her own baby. And so Stacy said, well, let's think what we can do to handle this, to mitigate the risk. And is there anybody who you can call for help? If your baby is crying and it's 2 a.m. and you're really angry, what can you do? And Bonnie said, there's nobody. And Stacy pushed her again, and finally Bonnie said, well, there's a woman in the building, an older woman in the building, maybe I could call her. And so Stacy helped Bonnie get the woman's name, write down her phone number on the wall, ready for help in a crisis. And sure enough, that woman did play a supportive role in Bonnie's life and the child's life, and she managed to contain her anger and did just great as a mom. And that's broadly true, that Nurse Family Partnership, even though it ends when the kids are age 2, the state-verified cases of child abuse are 78% lower than in kids randomly not assigned to the intervention. And when the kids are 15, even though this program has ended 13 years before, the kids are only half as likely to have been arrested. So here you have this, program that truly makes a difference, that saves $6 for every $1 spent in public funds that would otherwise be spent on incarceration, this kind of thing. And yet it only reaches 2 to 3% of the kids who need it in this country. And that is just infuriating. I think there are a few different ways in which we sort of get hung up on these issues. And one of the things that I always hear when I write about inequality, whether it's domestic or abroad, is the kind of comment that, well, if they really wanted to, they could do better. There's a question of kind of discipline. And look, I made it. I worked hard in school. I work hard in my job. I don't break the law. And look, I'm doing just fine. And that, I think, again, goes to kind of the empathy gap. There is a blunt reality that there are pathologies of poverty, and one problem is that people engage in self-destructive behaviors, and that is true. But if you just point fingers rather than offering helping hands, you're just part of the problem, not the solution. And it is so easy for those who have been born on third base with every advantage, hearing those 30 million words by age 4, to think, oh wow, I'm hitting home runs all the time, and then criticize people who didn't have that advantage for not doing so. And so where one has these programs that can make a difference, it's so frustrating that they don't get more support. Susan Fiske at Princeton ran a fascinating experiment where she put successful people under a brain scanner and had them look at images of people who were homeless or manifestly poor. And she found that those successful people that their brains processed these images as if they were looking at things, not people. And this is, I think, part of the broader problem, and that's what we have to crack if we want to both create that empathy and build bridges and build solutions. Another hang-up we sometimes have, I think, has to do with a sort of basic question of why we should care. And there are a lot of reasons why we should care, and they have to do with the difference we can make in other people's lives. But there's also, I think, a really selfish reason. Is one thing I think that the generation of millennials really kind of gets, and that is just the degree of empowerment one derives oneself from engaging in some kind of a cause larger than herself. And there have been all kinds of studies showing this. Harvard did since the 1930s, a cohort at Harvard has been followed and to look at their health and what correlates to longer life expectancy, this kind of thing. And it turns out that kind of engaging in larger causes is more correlated to longer life expectancy than cholesterol levels are. There was likewise, one study of seniors found that there were 3 factors in particular that reduced mortality. One was joining a religious organization, a church or synagogue or whatever it might be, and that reduced mortality levels by 29%. Likewise, exercising several times a week reduced mortality by 30%. And volunteering for 2 or more organizations reduced mortality by 44%. Presumably, if you actually volunteered for a religious running organization, you're immortal. But we also, there were all these correlations, and then lately we've seen it in brain scans as well. There are these pleasure centers in the brain that the nucleus accumbens and others that light up when somebody's flirting with you, or they say nice things about you, or you have sex, or you take drugs. These sort of glow like that. And there's a lab that puts people in this scanner, and their brains are examined as they both receive money and as they make donations. And so Cheryl and I did this. And so, like most people, the nucleus accumbens, it glows, the pleasure centers, they glow when we are given money, but they also glow when you make a donation. You have a screen in front of you and a clicker in your hands, and so you can make donations to a organization, a charity or good organization, and you see your pleasure centers light up when you do that as well. And for about half of American research subjects, it differs with, some people are more altruistic or derive more pleasure than others, but for about half of Americans, they derive as much or more pleasure from the giving as they do from the getting. So there's something really powerful going on here. And I think there's also a way of kind of finding meaning in a disorderly and sometimes scary or random world. We talk about a girl named Rachel Beckwith, who you may remember. She was a little girl in Seattle who had started a birthday fundraiser on charity water. And for her 9th birthday, she wanted to raise $300 for wells in Ethiopia. She was disappointed because she only raised $220 in lieu of birthday gifts. And then a few weeks after that birthday, when the page was still up, she was in a car accident, very gravely injured. And her friends and family, they were searching for some way of showing solidarity with her. She was in a coma, Rachel was. And so they began donating on her birthday page to raise money to help her meet her goal. And so then it shot past her goal of 300, shot past 1,000, shot past 10,000, and she's lying there unresponsive in the hospital, and her parents are whispering to her that she's set a new record on charity water. She's surpassed Justin Bieber's record for the amount he raised on his birthday. She's passed 50,000, and she dies, and there's obviously nothing that can solve the loss of a 9-year-old child to her parents, but this really took off in social media, and they raised $1.2 million on her birthday page, enough for 37,000 people to get water who otherwise wouldn't have. And it's obviously a tragedy, but I think it felt so random, so awful, and this was at least some way of leaving Rachel a legacy, finding some meaning, some larger purpose for her life. And I've certainly felt that. Maybe I'll just leave you with a story that is kind of personal. And think of tough questions to put me on the spot. In the meantime, we'll take questions in a moment. But one of the things I hear all the time is that the problems are just too big, you can't solve them. And that's true. I mean, these global, there's no cause I believe in more than girls' education. But that is huge. None of us here are going to solve the problem of girls' education. But I always think back to my dad. And he was a refugee after World War II from Romania. He was in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia was executing some of these refugees and releasing others to the West. And a French diplomat wrote a brief letter to the Yugoslav authorities just mentioning my dad's name. And that was enough to get the Yugoslavs to release my dad. He ended up in France as a refugee. He was cleaning hotel rooms, and he thought he wanted to come to America. He thought that a East European refugee would have a better chance in America. And there was a young woman from Portland, Oregon, who was working in Paris for the Marshall Plan. He was cleaning her hotel room. She liked him. She thought he was smart. So she persuaded her parents, who had never met him, to sponsor his way to the U.S. And he was Catholic, but they and their church, the First Presbyterian Church in Portland, they sponsored his way to come to the U.S. They took a risk on this guy they'd never met. And, that didn't solve the global refugee problem. But for my dad, for me, it was pretty transformative. And I think in the same way, we may not be able to solve some of these vast global issues, but for very small amounts of money, we can send a girl to school somewhere. We can make sure that a kid, we write about an organization called Reach Out and Read for $20. You can get a kid in this country books and a prescription to read that means more books are being read in that household. There's so many little interventions that truly will make a difference in other people's lives. Or there's advocacy, there's volunteering, even on iMentor, on a platform like that. There's so many things we can do. And I think it's my dad's experience that partly leads me to want to give back. And I hope that you'll find ways in A Path Appears to do the same. Thanks very much. I'd love to take questions. Thank you. There are a couple of microphones right here, so just line up and I'll just go back and forth. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you so much. My name is Sally and I work in communications and social media. So I want to ask you, I read Half the Sky, I followed your movement on social media, you did a great job with that. So I'm wondering what you have to say about the role of social media and getting just beyond advocacy and just beyond giving money, like with the Ice Bucket Challenge, and I heard you talk on Kojo Nandi's show about that today, but what else can social media do that kind of is a result of what you're calling for in your book as well?
I think social media can be really important, partly because, frankly, we in the news media are sometimes dropping the ball on some of these issues, especially some global issues. I did the count in late August that that South Sudan, which has had a civil war and a looming famine, has had 3 minutes of network evening news coverage so far in 2014. Meanwhile, MH317, the missing Malaysian airliner, had 300 minutes, 100 times as much. And so I think that, as the news media, as our business model erodes, then there are a lot of important global stories that aren't being covered. And I think that social media efforts are one way of trying to rectify that balance. When the Nigerian girls were kidnapped, originally that story really took off only because of social media. The Ice Bucket Challenge, again, went viral, and if that can raise more money for a great cause, then that's great. And I hope that people can hold our feet to the fire and hold other people's feet to the fire to kind of keep us paying attention to some important global issues and to kind of give voice to those people who don't have it themselves.
Hi, thanks for being here. In my previous position, I was a reporter with the Des Moines Register, and we devoted a year to the child and to look at ways to help stem the effects of the state's rising child poverty rates. And at the end of the series, there's the big question that you talked about was scale. And I'm wondering if you've looked at collective impact models of cities who come together and say, we're going to concentrate on 1, 2, or 3 issues. Have those been successful, or have you seen any positive results in cities that have decided to have all their nonprofits work on the same goals?
I think scaling is a really important issue, and one of the problems is that a lot of interventions initially work as experiments, and then when you try to scale them up, they don't work as well. And but I think we also at this point have some pretty good evidence of programs that work truly on scale. The Boston Early Childhood Education Program, there's really pretty good evidence of the impact that that has had in a city the size of Boston. And you get, likewise, I would say that to some degree, the Pakistan versus Bangladesh or Oman versus Yemen examples are kind of an example of interventions at at broad national levels, that the difference that can make. One of the ways in which I think about this and am a little bit ambivalent about is that so many young people want to start their own organization. They want to be social entrepreneurs, and that's great, and I really believe in a lot of small interventions. On the other hand, if everybody starts their own intervention and nobody joins an existing one, then we've got a problem. And indeed, in the nonprofit sector, there are a million tiny organizations that don't achieve scale, and there isn't really M&A, which would be a natural way to kind of bring these together. And so in general, my advice for people is, as a default position, join an existing organization that has professionalism, that has a record that you feel confident in. And if you can't find one, or if there's some reason to go your own way, then of course we need startups, but don't just do a startup just for the sake of a startup.
You spoke tonight, and especially more today on the radio in our town, about the difficulty and the importance of distinguishing between effective and ineffective uses of our resources. And I want to ask you the mirror image of that. And that's because you've already guessed now from this backstory that I run a charity which runs 6 community libraries and community action centers in subsistence farming communities. And when I put in my last $15 million and then went broke in the crash, and so now we have to rely on the public. What I want to know is, how can we advertise effectiveness? This is an area where even the people who do this in other places come and tell us, you know how to do this and we don't, we should adopt your model. But when we look for support, all the oxygen has been sucked out of the air by mostly, to tell the truth, corrupt phonies, people who have gone into this as a way of finding a job. And there are no metrics for whose libraries work and whose don't. And the New York Times, I remember especially, a few years ago, ran a front page article about a wonderful public library in Guatemala. And that was in the neighborhood where I work. And so this library had signs all over saying, don't touch the books. Most of them were in English instead of Spanish. The children's corner had a sign that said, no talking in the children's corner. And the day after the founder moved away from town, the library closed. Now, we have 65 libraries that work. Why is it that they're on the front page and I'm not?
You know, I mean, this question of determining kind of what is a good charity or not is a really hard one. And one of the mistakes I think that people have made is focusing just on cost ratios. And that's, I mean, that can be relevant. Obviously, you don't want to donate to a charity that is just using your money to build a great marble lobby. But at the end of the day, you know, cost is, what you want is a nonprofit with impact, not one that isn't investing in computer systems and good administration and so on. And impact is a lot harder to measure and to determine. And one of the problems is that nonprofits typically do, they do a certain amount of evaluation, but it's usually self-evaluation, and it's usually about as rigorous as, you know, grandparents doing an evaluation of their grandkids. I think I'm in this situation because as an author and as a journalist, nonprofits are always coming to me and saying, we have this great project doing amazing work, and, you know, here's this great evaluation we've done. And I just don't really know. I mean, to some degree, sometimes when you're on the ground, you can sort of see some of these things, as you say about the Guatemala Library, not always. One of the things that I have come to rely on more and more, and it is not true everywhere, but is randomized controlled trials, where you have an intervention that is really carefully measured, and you get people who are randomly assigned to some areas and not to others. And so, for example, in trying to figure out how to get more girls in school in some area, turns out that if you do it by building bricks and mortar schools, then the cost is about $350 to get one marginal child in school. If you do it by investing in school uniforms, because one of the crazy things that happens in so many countries is you have to have a school uniform to attend school. And so that becomes an impediment. If you subsidize school uniforms, you can get one marginal child in school for about $100. The most cost-effective way of getting another child in school, again, through these randomized trials, is to deworm kids. We don't think about that because our kids don't have intestinal worms. Most kids in much of the world do. And that means they're more likely to be sick, they're more likely to be anemic. Girls who are menstruating are particularly vulnerable to anemia, and when they have intestinal parasites on top of that, they're even weaker and more anemic. And yet we don't deworm kids, even though there's this really rigorous evidence base from randomized trials that works. But they're expensive to do. It doesn't apply in every kind of intervention. And that question of efficacy is a really hard one that there aren't always good answers to.
Well, you've asked the same question again that I was asking, but the question is, how does an effective organization tell its story to people who are interested in beautiful and heart-rending pictures?
I mean, the only advice I can offer is to try to, I think it helps to have an outside evaluation, not internal. Have people who know the area, who are credible, who are independent. I think those evaluations help. If one can do a randomized controlled trial, which is expensive, that certainly gets much more credibility from outsiders, from funders, but it's not always feasible depending on the intervention.
Dear Mr. Kristof, I know enough about you to know that I'm wondering if you would possibly share with me and with us what you say to yourself when you do get discouraged. Because I know I've read enough about some of the situations that you've been in where there have been cultural or institutional government reasons, and you have worked really hard, and it's very complicated, it's very elaborate, and you get to this one point and something happens. And I'm just an individual who helps a few people, but they are people very much like Jessica. They are homeless, they are confined to a wheelchair, they have absolutely no credentials. They have incredible medical needs, and they have no clean clothes, and then they were recently arrested for shoplifting. And there are times when I feel like so overwhelmed by trying so hard to do the right, to advise in the right way, to get there, to try to find, and yet there are so many other factors that are coming from so many different areas that can blow it up in any minute. So I know you're a very positive man, but what do you say to yourself in those times?
It's true. Helping people is harder than it looks, and everything possible that can go wrong will. And I've had my heart broken plenty of times, as I'm sure you have. I guess, at least in my case, I find sustenance and comfort in those cases that do work out, where one can have an impact. And you sort of know going in that you're going to be disappointed periodically. And yet, periodically, there is something that, I think of it a little like investments or maybe venture capital. And you go in thinking every investment is going to be great, this is exciting, and then, boy, there's some real dogs there. But hopefully you will get some that will really shine. People are always kind of puzzled that I've made this career out of covering genocide and sex trafficking and poverty, and yet I'm this basically kind of bubbly, warm, enthusiastic guy. And, how can this be? And the truth is also that side by side with the worst of humanity, you usually see the very best. And in this country, we're not tested in the same way, but in Darfur, in Eastern Congo, I remember one trip to Eastern Congo and saw a warlord who was murdering people and raping people, and I interviewed him. He was just evil. But he left an impression on me about the human capacity for evil. But there was also this amazing Polish nun there who had stayed behind when other aid workers had been evacuated, and she was feeding the orphans and trying to keep kids in school and negotiating with the warlord to try to keep them at bay. And I returned with an even deeper impression of her about this human capacity to respond to evil with an unbelievable strength and courage and altruism. That I managed to come back from Eastern Congo feeling better about humanity. And then in contrast, you come here and you find, people are expressing their humanity by having the latest hot car, which really is a little depressing. So, just have to look for it and celebrate when you find it and can have that impact. Thank you for what you do.
That was a great question. Because of great authors and journalists such as yourself, the internet, and the greater social media bubble, I think because of today's age, it's very easy to be aware of issues, to make people aware of issues, to share information, and to just, I think the public as a whole is just bombarded by every day with all the issues that are going on in the world, all the ways they can either get involved or things they should care more about. But the problem I think has been is that activists and people that do charity work and try to raise awareness, they just focus on sharing information, and the issue in my experience has been causing people to do something about it, to get involved in some way, or to just donate that $1. And I guess my question is what do you think are some good ways that you've seen that have gone the extra mile or done something in a different way to really cause people action, or what are some ways that activists can improve?
It's a fascinating question, and it's one that, one that we write about in the book, and that I got engaged in Darfur, because I was going off to Darfur, and it felt like the columns I was writing were just sinking without a ripple. And meanwhile, I don't know if some of you are from New York, but at that time in 2004, there were these hawks in Central Park, pale male, and I can't even remember what his wife's name was, but these two hawks that were living in a nest on Fifth Avenue, as I recall, and the apartment building there had kicked them out of, didn't like the bird dropping, so kicked them out of their building. And New York was all up in arms about these two homeless hawks in Central Park. And I couldn't generate the same amount of outrage about hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered. And I thought, what is wrong with my journalism? And so that led me to the work of this scholar named Paul Slovic, who we write about, who looks at what makes connections, what gets us to care, what gets us engaged. And it's basically about two things. It's about individual stories and in an emotional, not rational connection. And there, for example, the more of the class of victims, the less we care. And we know that kind of in theory, but the point at which our empathy diminishes is actually when the number of victims rises from 1 to 2. The moment you even have a second victim, or you talk about a second person's story, then empathy declines. And likewise, if you ask people to do math problems, and then you ask them to donate, they donate less because the math has kind of gotten our more rational parts of the brain working, and that interrupts this emotional bond. And the other thing that is necessary is some arc of hope, that if you just tell people terrible stories, that Darfur is this tragedy, hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered, it leaves people sensing that it's terrible, but I can't do anything. It leaves them helpless. And so, the lesson that I drew from that, and if you read my column, you'll see that in it, and you'll see it in Half the Sky and in A Path Appears, and in the documentaries. It's telling stories to try to open those pathways, and then once that pathway is open, then to throw in some of the data and the background, and also to try to avoid leaving people just depressed by be blunt about how big the problems are, but show that there can indeed be, that if you push the right levers, that you can make a difference. And so I commend that chapter to you.
Thank you.
So say you have the hope and say you have the individual stories, but you're internationally based, you're based in the Middle East. How do you establish the legitimacy without the benefit of Charity Navigator or a track record? I run a not-for-profit that helps disadvantaged kids in Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East with education opportunity. But I don't have 7 years of 990s, and I don't have that stamp of legitimacy. So how would you advise would-be donors and social entrepreneurs like us saving the next generation?
Since I don't know your organization, I don't know that I can give great advice. I think that's a real challenge, and there's so many great organizations doing great work, but in a small scale, so that other people don't really know about it and don't know how to judge it. And I'm afraid I just don't have good advice about how to break that cycle. I'm sorry.
Hope's a good place to start.
Hi, I'm the nurse who was raising my hand before. So my question is about healthcare and a short request. I don't think any of the chapters in here are about midwifery care, so I would like to request that your next book be all about midwifery care.
Okay.
So what I see as a labor and delivery nurse is that it's not just that, how do I say this? I had it all thought out, right? And then I got to the microphone. So it's not just that poverty begins at childbirth or begins in these new years, but it's also that one's health affects poverty, and poverty affects their health. In America, if you are from a poor demographic, you tend to have more children. So I feel like part of, yes, education is the answer, but healthcare is also the answer. So obviously healthcare in America is a shit show. So have you seen it good anywhere? And especially have you seen it good for women in their healthcare system anywhere? Because I want to study that and figure that out.
Yeah, I really do see progress. Both in the world of reproductive health, both here and abroad. In the U.S., I think one real improvement has been that since 1990, the teen birth rate has dropped in half. And I think, it is crazy that we don't invest more in trying to help troubled teens avoid getting pregnant. And this would save money if we would do it. There's overwhelming. Colorado just had an experiment funded by a private donor giving long-acting reversible contraceptives like IUDs or implants to adolescent girls who were kind of at risk, and it reduced the birth rate, and it saved the state of Colorado substantial sums. And now this funder did it as a demonstration project to show that it would work, and indeed it worked. And now the question is, will Colorado now implement it, or will other states? And it's crazy that they don't do that. The cost both to that teenage mom and the way it is going to push her out of high school, prevent her from getting a longer education, and the toll it's going to have on that child is outrageous. And yet we don't do that. The same, likewise internationally, 220 million women who want access to contraception who don't get it. And it would pay for itself to do that. But I do, now back to being an optimist, the teen birth rate has indeed dropped in half.
It has.
And globally, maternal mortality, which is just one of the great injustices of the world, women dying unnecessarily for playing a reproductive role, that has dropped. The number of women dying in childbirth has dropped from about 550,000 to about 350,000. There's some push now to address cervical cancer, which is killing more than 300,000 women a year worldwide, totally unnecessarily. So feels like inch by inch, some of these issues, we're making some progress, and it's up to your generation to keep, our feet to the fire and keep pushing us.
Okay, but write the next book on midwives.
Okay.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Sorry for the rest of you guys. Let's see, your turn.
It's on my side. Nick, thanks for a great talk tonight. I was really interested to hear you talk about the military toolkit because I study security. And I was also really interested to see there's a section in your book called Reforming the Art of Helping. And I know AFRICOM, the US Africa Command, has a $750 million toolkit to take to the Ebola response. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how that can be optimized, how that intervention can be done well, and what you would like to see.
I was getting some feedback here. This was how the Ebola?
So where should I start from?
Kind of about halfway through.
Sure. So you talked about the military toolkit and how important that is, and you also talked about reforming the art of helping people. And we have a $750 million toolkit for AFRICOM to help with Ebola. I know you usually talk at the individual level, but at the institutional level, what would you like to see in this intervention?
My basic concern is that we instinctively see security only in terms of military threats, and there are all kinds of threats that come at us in other directions, but we don't invest in them unless we think that somebody's going to blow things up. And we're willing to invest in contingencies if it's some small possibility that somebody will engage in a terror attack, for example. But if it's a risk of an infectious disease or something nutrition related, then we don't invest at all in it. And it seems to me that overall one of the great ways in which the world has changed has been literacy. And for all of human history, until 1950, a majority of humans were illiterate. Since 1950, a majority of adults have actually been literate now, and the number of illiterate adults is declining. This is something that we can push and accelerate with very modest sums of money, and we need some of that military toolkit, and I'm an advocate of using it in specific circumstances where it can give us an advantage on an ad hoc basis. In Iraq, airstrikes did actually manage to save a lot of Yazidi lives, but I think we vastly overemphasize that toolkit, and I think the education toolkit in particular and the health toolkit over the medium term and the long term gets us much farther. And one of the things that most frustrates me is I travel in Pakistan or in West Africa, and I see fundamentalists with kind of a 13th century mindset who understand the transformative power of education, and they're investing in Wahhabi madrasas in these places. Or the Taliban shot Malala for a good rational reason. They understood that the greatest threat to extremism is a girl with a book. Boko Haram, kidnap those girls because they understand. Educating girls in northern Nigeria is a threat to everything they stand for. The extremists understand this extremely well, and they act rationally from their point of view. And we don't understand it as well as they do. We don't invest in education to the same extent, even though one soldier deployed for 1 year could fund more than 20 schools. And I wish we could have as much faith in the transformative power of education as some extremists with 13th century mindsets.
Thank you very much.
So with the education question in mind, somebody comes to you and says, I have $1,000 and I want to give it to one specific cause. What is the most, is it education? Is it fighting against trafficking? What is the biggest need for people to be putting their money into?
You know, I don't think there's any one answer to that, and I think there is this yearning for kind of this silver bullet, and there's no silver bullet out there. It's all silver buckshot. And I think what somebody cares about and wants to invest in will depend on their own background. For some people, it's education, or especially girls' education, or for other people, it's going to be clean water. For other people, it's going to be nutrition, or one of the great nutritional interventions that would save 600,000 lives a year is if breastfeeding were optimized in the developing world. 600,000 lives a year. There are all these different interventions one can advocate for that will have far-reaching impacts, but I'm reluctant to say, here's the one.
Right.
Because different people, I think, have different issues that move them, that appeal to them, and I don't know that there's one transcendent. I mean, education is particularly dear to my heart, and especially girls' education. I think you get a little more bang for the buck out of girls' education than you do out of boys' education, partly because girls are less likely to get educated. But I guess I would just really counsel you to find some issue that particularly speaks to you. Don't try to do everything. I think you're probably better off learning and focusing on one issue, maybe one organization that seems particularly profound. Get engaged with it, learn about it. Maybe it's writing checks, maybe it's volunteering, maybe it's advocacy. And know that our efforts at the end of the day to help other people have a somewhat mixed record, but that they do have this almost perfect record of helping ourselves. I think that's kind of how I see it. Thank you so much, all of you.